It's been 26 years since the Chinese Communist regime started the persecution of Falun Gong in China. Joining us now to discuss this is Cynthia Sun, researcher for the Falun Dafa Information Center and fellow at the First Freedom Foundation. Good afternoon, Cynthia. Thanks for coming on. Thank you so much. So for those unfamiliar, can you briefly explain what is Falun Dafa and why it's targeted by the Chinese Communist Party?
Sure. Thank you for having me today. So Falun Dafa is a traditional meditation. It's a spiritual practice based in Buddhism. And for 30 plus years now, it's been practiced around the world in over 110 countries now, peacefully, without any disruptions from government or from anything else. But obviously in China, the Chinese Communist Party doesn't let religion be practiced freely. And the people don't have the right to faith, the right to their unalienable rights to believe in a higher power and believe in divine. And so for 26 years now, yesterday marked the 26th anniversary, Falun Gong practitioners by the millions have been detained, have been tortured. Some have even been killed through forced organ harvesting, which is a crime so abhorrent that most people can't even believe it when they first hear about it. And, everyone here in New York City came out this weekend to really say, we're here, we're standing strong, and we're not wavering in our commitment to faith, in our commitment to human rights, and we will see the persecution end in this generation.
So you mentioned the parade yesterday. So in general, how have Falun Gong practitioners responded to the persecution? You said these are very peaceful people.
Yeah, so part of Buddhism and part of traditional Chinese culture is that non-violent element, that element of peace, of healing yourself and looking within rather than trying to blame others for their faults or their mistakes. And so part of Falun Gong really is this compassion and this truth and seeking to persevere in your faith rather than trying to change others. And I think that's been the response of most practitioners worldwide, is trying to follow these three core principles, regardless of what the situation is, regardless of whether the Chinese Communist Party is persecuting them or not. And I even heard stories from people who survived forced labor camps that they espouse these values and practice them so diligently that even prison guards and even police officers gave up their hat and gave up their standing to try to free these individuals and free prisoners of conscience. And it's such an inspiring but human story of faith.
So I do want to talk about what has happened in this persecution for 26 years, but I just have one more question about the parade yesterday. It was different because it was actually the first time a top performing arts company in the world attended. Talk to us about the significance that Shenyun dancers actually participated in this parade.
Yeah, sure. It was a surprise to us all. As most people probably know, a lot of Falun Gong practitioners have normal jobs in their daily lives. They're either, working in STEM or in social science like I am, or they work in the field of arts, performing arts. And so these performers for 18 years now have formed a company in New York where they tried to use art as their medium, to use these creative performances as their medium to raise awareness about human rights. And so joining this parade is an extension of that, but it's also a really strong message to the Chinese Communist Party, because Shenyun has been the target of very, very violent and very horrible transnational repression, including death threats, including bomb threats to the theaters that they're performing at, and multiple other threats that are so graphic that I don't even want to mention right now. For them to step outside of the stage, to step outside of their practice rooms and take time off of their preparations for tour next year is such a strong message. They're here in Manhattan, as you can see, walking down some of the largest streets in the country saying, we're here. We're not just performers. We're humans. We're people of faith. We are not victims, but we will tell the story of our community because, in the end, there will be a China without communism, and the victor will get to tell that tale.
So as I'm looking at the footage while you were speaking, it looks like there were thousands of people at that parade. But I do believe that's actually the tip of the iceberg because there's actually tens of millions of people practicing this discipline. So I'm trying to wrap my head around this. How is it possible that millions of people, practicing meditation, living by truthfulness, compassion, and tolerance, instantly became enemies of the state overnight, the Chinese regime?
Yeah, and I think that's a good way to describe it, overnight, because most people don't know this, but Falun Gong was actually supported and kind of advertised by the Chinese Communist Party in the early 90s. There's a huge boom of spirituality, a huge boom of yoga, of Tai Chi, of Qigong, and that carried on until it became more popular than the Chinese Communist Party. And so the tyrant of the time, Jiang Zemin, decided to single-handedly eradicate Falun Gong. That was his words, not ours. And I think that really spells, the whole history of the persecution from that point on, carrying on through different leaders up until Xi Jinping, has been to try to eradicate this peaceful group of people that won't fight back, that has meditation. And it's actually kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy because Jiang Zemin said that he wanted to eradicate this group of people. But in his methods, in the tactics to eradicate this faithful group, he actually created the largest grassroots movement that I know of in China in modern history to expose the Chinese Communist Party, to expose the crimes that the regime has wrought onto its people over the past few years and even the past few decades. So without the persecution starting, Shenyang Performing Arts might not have started. Different companies like my organization, the Falun Dafa Information Center, would not have started, and we wouldn't have needed to have this network of millions of people exposing COVID, exposing all of these different crimes, forced organ harvesting, to the Chinese people and to the world. So in this way, I think it's possibly their worst mistake that they've ever made.
It's incredible hearing what you say, and it makes me wonder, and maybe you can comment on this as well. The fact that the followers were able to withstand, 26 years of persecution, even inside China, where the communist regime has an iron grip on every aspect of society.
Yeah, I mean, surveillance has just increased. I have family back in China, and I say from experience that in the early 2000s, the surveillance is nothing like what it is today, where you have smartphones, you have apps, you have dozens of surveillance cameras in every intersection that you walk through, even police presence in train stations and facial recognition. It's gotten out of control in China, and it truly has become a surveillance state. And like you were mentioning earlier, the resistance of this group of people, there has to be some sort of marker in history for this, some sort of museum in the future to really study how such a spiritual group has survived the physical warfare that has been taken upon by the CCP to eliminate them. It really is a physical war on a spiritual group. And when you try to fight something like spirituality, faith in God and the divine, something you can't touch, you can't see, you can't access, you can't visit, I think it is a losing war for the CCP. And the Chinese Communist Party is seeing that more and more. Falun Gong is not a spiritual group that can be eliminated because spirituality is at the core of everyone's conscience. That's the closest thing we have. So I've heard some practitioners even yesterday saying, the CCP tried to end my life. They tried to take my family. They did take my job and they took my education, but they can't take my faith. And I think that really spells, the theme of this anniversary.
So you mentioned physical war, so I have to bring this up. There has been credible allegations of forced organ harvesting of Falun Gong practitioners. What do we know about that?
Yeah, I mean, the most recent thing is obviously Mr. Chung, who is a survivor, the first known and only known survivor of forced organ harvesting. But for 20 years now, we've been hearing about hospitals who admit through video and phone calls that they have prisoners of conscience, specifically Falun Gong practitioners, who they take the organs from. We have Chinese documents and Chinese doctors who are giving up their scalpel and coming abroad and testifying to the world that they did have organ harvesting in China. And we also have multiple books of different, directives from hospital directors or even from medical and pharmaceutical companies who are saying, that the ingredients to organ transplantation, the supplies needed, are actually used on an unethical procedure. And unfortunately, this has become our reality. And Mr. Chung, actually, I was grateful to have been able to host him for a forum in the Capitol Visitor Center last Thursday. And he really detailed how, after his escape from forced organ harvesting, he had part of his lung and liver removed. There was a bounty on his head from authorities in China who didn't want him to be alive to tell his tale. Even now, he says, his home has been broken into and loved ones back in China still call him and try to seduce him back to China so that, he'll disappear, basically. And it really does tell a tale of how the Chinese Communist Party is trying to control the life and death of their citizens. And for Chinese citizens who do practice Falun Gong, they're trying to control even their organs, whether or not they donate their organs involuntarily. They're trying to control their families. They're trying to control, the narratives and even their activism. And so every aspect of it really is part of a larger machine of the Chinese Communist Party to treat and sell their citizens as commodities rather than human beings.
So you were mentioning that forum that you were talking about. We here at NTD actually broadcast that forum, and I was watching it. Mr. Chung was showing the scar that wrapped around his chest to his back, and he was talking about how it was many, many inches longer than what the Chinese regime claimed it to be. So do you think this issue has enough global coverage? Has it received enough coverage? Why or why not? And what can people do so more people become aware of this issue as well as the overall persecution?
Yeah, unfortunately, it hasn't had enough coverage. In my view, Mr. Chung is, such an incredible individual with such a brave soul. He continues to face transnational oppression and threats to this day for revealing his story. And I think that speaks to the fear that the Chinese Communist Party has, the fear that survivors will live to tell the tale and expose the crimes that the CCP has done. So I don't believe there's been enough media coverage. And a reason for that, I really do believe, is because the news and the general population don't know that much about organ transplantation in China. They're not really involved because they themselves don't need organs. So it's a very small community that are actually following the issue, such as, current medical doctors, patients on the waiting list who are looking for alternative options and may be recommended by a doctor or even a friend to go to China to get an organ, and they don't know what the source of that organ is. And the third, I would say, is lawmakers who are actually actively working to stop American complicity in organ transplantation in China, organ harvesting. So aside from that population, I think it is lost on the general public. I know some pop culture events like Squid Games being released has brought back light onto the Chinese Communist Party's forced organ harvesting. But aside from that, I think it just needs to hit the news cycle in the right way. And honestly, I think Mr. Chung should be awarded or recommended for a Nobel Peace Prize for the amount of work that he's done to expose this issue.
Well, Cynthia, we have to leave it there for our conversation today. Once again, it's so good to talk to you. Thank you for coming on.
Thank you so much.